Their lips met in the darkness, and Alexander Stone, the man who never loved, trembled. His hand slid into Grace's hair, pulling her deeper into a kiss that tasted like 6 months of impossible longing. When they broke apart, breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I didn't know I was alive until you," he whispered against her mouth. Her fingers traced his jaw as tears fell. "You burned your empire for me." His thumb brushed her lips. "I'd do it again." But this moment almost died. 6 months ago, she stood outside his glass wall, invisible and heartbroken, watching him prepare to marry someone else. How did the coldest heart learn to burn? Alexander Stone didn't need to raise his voice. He never had to. The boardroom fell silent the moment he entered, his footsteps sharp against marble floors. 34 years old, and he'd already built an empire that made grown men nervous. Stone Capital wasn't just an investment firm. It was a kingdom, and Alexander ruled it with precision that bordered on cruelty. "Revenue dropped 2%, he said, his voice cold and measured. He didn't sit. He never sat during terminations. The first executive opened his mouth to explain. Alexander raised one finger. The man went silent. "You're done. Security will escort you out." One down. The second executive, a woman who'd been with the company for 8 years, tried a different approach. Confidence. She stood shoulders back, ready to defend her division's numbers. Alexander's eyes met hers. No anger. No emotion at all. Just ice. "You're done." 2 down. The third executive didn't even try. He gathered his things and left before Alexander spoke. Smart man. 3 terminations before 9 a.m. Alexander returned to his office and answered emails without a flicker of hesitation. His assistant, Margaret, 20 years his senior and the only person who'd lasted more than 3 years, brought his coffee in silence. She'd learned long ago that small talk died in his presence. "Remind me about the Anderson merger," he said, eyes fixed on his screen. "Conference call at 2. Documents are ready." "Good." Margaret hesitated at the door. "Sir, the new temporary assistant starts tomorrow. Grace Montgomery. I've sent her file to your—" "Fine." He didn't look up. Margaret left quietly. They called him the glacier behind his back. Alexander knew. He didn't care. Fear kept people sharp. Sentiment made them weak. He'd learned that lesson young, and he'd learned it well. By 6 p.m., the office floors were empty. By 8, even the security team knew not to disturb him. Alexander worked until midnight most nights, alone in a building that overlooked the city like a fortress. When he finally returned to his penthouse, the space greeted him with the warmth of a tomb. Floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furniture, art worth millions, everything perfectly curated, everything cold. He poured himself scotch he didn't want and stood at the window. 40 stories below, the city pulsed with life, people laughing, fighting, loving, suffering. He watched them the way someone might watch ants in a jar. Distant, detached. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother about another charity gala he'd be expected to attend. Another performance. He deleted it without responding. Alexander Stone had everything a man could want. Power that moved markets. Wealth that built legacies. Control that bent the world to his will. He finished his scotch and felt nothing. Somewhere in the silence, a thought surfaced, small, unwelcome, quickly buried. Is this all there is? He ignored it. He always did. Tomorrow, Margaret had said. A new assistant. He didn't even remember her name. It didn't matter. They never stayed long anyway. Grace Montgomery had stopped counting rejections after the 12th one. She sat in the corner of a coffee shop she couldn't really afford, nursing a single cup that had gone cold an hour ago. Her laptop was open to another job listing, executive assistant, temp position, immediate start. She'd applied. She'd been applying everywhere. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. * Your brother's treatment schedule has been moved up. Payment due by Friday. *. Grace closed her eyes and did the math she'd already done 100 times. 2 jobs. 16-hour days. It still wasn't enough. She'd been invisible her whole life. The girl teachers forgot to call on. The employee managers overlooked for promotions. Even her own father had walked away without a second glance when she was 9. Being invisible meant being safe. But it also meant being alone. Her stomach growled. She'd bought a sandwich an hour ago, her only meal for the day, but she hadn't touched it yet. She was rationing, saving it for later, when the hunger got unbearable. Then she saw him. An older man, maybe 70, sitting on the bench outside. His clothes were worn, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to warm them against the autumn cold. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just there, invisible like her. Grace looked at her sandwich, then at him, then at her empty bank account on her phone screen. She didn't think. She just moved. "Excuse me, sir?" She stepped outside, the sandwich wrapped in paper. "I ordered too much. Would you like this?" The man's eyes filled with something Grace recognized. Gratitude. The kind you feel when someone sees you. "God bless you," he whispered. Grace smiled, even though her stomach ached. "You too." When she returned to her table, a woman at the counter was watching her. Mid-50s, sharp suit, expensive bag. The woman didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, as if she'd witnessed something worth remembering. Grace didn't notice. She was already back to her laptop, refreshing her email for the 100th time. Nothing. 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 Her landlord's final notice was folded in her bag. 3 days. That's all she had left. She whispered a prayer under her breath, something she'd been doing more often lately. Not because she expected miracles, just because she needed to believe someone was listening. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Hello, Miss Montgomery? This is Margaret Chen from Stone Capital. We received your application for the temporary assistant position. Can you start tomorrow?" Grace's breath caught. Yes. Yes, absolutely. 8 a.m. sharp. Mr. Stone doesn't tolerate lateness." The line went dead. Grace sat frozen, staring at her phone. She didn't know who Mr. Stone was. She didn't know what the job would be like. But she'd been given a chance. "Thank you, God," she whispered. She had no idea she'd just been hired by the most feared man in the city, or that tomorrow everything would change. Grace's hands were shaking when she entered the boardroom. She'd been at Stone Capital for exactly 47 minutes. Margaret had given her a quick tour, a stack of files, and one piece of advice. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. And whatever you do, don't make Mr. Stone repeat himself. Now Grace stood at the corner of the room, holding a tray of coffee cups, trying to remember who ordered what. 12 executives sat around a glass table. At the head sat Alexander Stone. She'd seen his photo online. It hadn't prepared her. He was younger than she expected. Sharp suit. Sharper eyes. He spoke in low, clipped sentences that made grown men shift in their seats. There was no warmth in his voice. No patience. Just cold, absolute control. "Revenue projections for Q4, he said, not looking up from his tablet. An executive stammered through an answer. Alexander cut him off mid-sentence. "Wrong. Next." Grace moved carefully along the table, setting down cups. Her heart pounded. She was almost finished. Just 2 more. Her sleeve caught the edge of a folder. Everything happened in slow motion. The coffee cup tipped. Hot liquid arced through the air and landed directly on Alexander Stone's suit jacket. The room went silent. Grace froze. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her. But she only saw one pair. Cold. Gray. Staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Most people would have panicked. Apologized a dozen times. Begged for forgiveness. Grace didn't. She set down the tray, grabbed the nearest napkin, and met his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stone," she said quietly. "Calm. Steady. Let me get you a replacement jacket immediately." She didn't grovel. Didn't make excuses. Just acknowledged the mistake and offered a solution. For 3 long seconds, Alexander said nothing. He stared at her, not with anger but with something else. Surprise, maybe. Or confusion. Then he stood. Coffee dripped from his sleeve. The suit had probably cost more than her rent for 6 months. "Everyone out," he said. The executives scattered like startled birds. Papers rustled. Chairs scraped. Within seconds, the room was empty except for Grace and Alexander. She stood her ground. "The jacket," he said slowly, as if testing her. "Where exactly do you plan to find a replacement?" "Your office. Margaret mentioned you keep a spare in the closet for emergencies." His eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In assessment. "Go!" Grace left without another word. Her hands didn't start shaking again until she was in the hallway. She returned 2 minutes later with the jacket. Alexander had removed the stained one. He took the replacement without comment, without thanks. Just slipped it on and returned to his tablet as if she didn't exist. "You're dismissed," he said. Grace turned to leave. "Miss Montgomery." She stopped. "Next time, double-check the tray before you move." "Yes, sir." She walked out. The door closed behind her. Inside the empty boardroom, Alexander Stone stood alone, staring at the door she'd just exited. Something about her silence unsettled him. Most people filled the air with nervous apologies. She hadn't. She'd looked him in the eye without fear, without performance. Just steady. He didn't understand why that stayed with him. Alexander Stone noticed things other people missed. It was how he'd built his empire, seeing patterns, reading people, staying 3 steps ahead. So he noticed when Grace hummed. It was soft, almost unconscious. She did it while organizing files, a melody he didn't recognize. No one hummed in his office. No one dared to seem that content. He noticed how she thanked the janitor by name every evening. How she held the elevator for the intern everyone else ignored. How she never complained, even when Margaret piled extra work on her desk. He told himself it didn't matter. She was temporary. She'd be gone in 3 months. But then he started asking her opinion. It began small. "Miss Montgomery, which report layout is clearer?" She'd answered without hesitation, pointing out details he'd missed. Then it grew. "What's your read on the Anderson team?" She'd paused, considered, then given him an assessment sharper than half his executives could manage. He didn't understand why he kept asking. He'd never consulted assistants before. One evening he stayed late, as always. The office was empty except for the night security. He was heading to the elevator when he heard it. Crying. Quiet. Muffled. Coming from the stairwell. Alexander stopped. He should keep walking. Whatever it wasn't his concern. He opened the stairwell door. Grace sat on the steps, phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. She didn't see him. I know, she whispered. "I'm trying. I'm doing everything I can." Her voice cracked. "Please don't give up, okay? I love you. I'll figure it out." The call ended. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. The kind of crying that comes from exhaustion and fear and a heart that's been breaking quietly for too long. Alexander stood frozen. He'd seen people cry before. Employees he'd fired. Competitors he'd crushed. It had never moved him. This did. He left before she could see him. That night, in his penthouse, Alexander opened his laptop. It took him 15 minutes to find the information he needed. Grace Montgomery. Younger brother Daniel. Stage 3 leukemia. Medical bills approaching 6 figures. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he initiated a wire transfer. Anonymous. Untraceable. The full amount, plus extra for future treatments. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark. For the first time in years, Alexander Stone felt something other than cold calculation. It was warm, uncomfortable, unfamiliar. He didn't have a name for it. The next morning, Grace arrived at work with red eyes. She was quiet, focused, professional as always. Then her phone rang. Alexander watched from his office as she answered. Watched her face change. Watched her hand fly to her mouth. Watched her collapse into her chair, tears streaming again, but different this time. Joy. Pure, overwhelming relief. She whispered something he couldn't hear. Then she looked up, as if searching for someone to thank. Her eyes were bright with gratitude for a miracle she'd never understand. Across the office, Alexander turned back to his work. His chest felt tight. He told himself it was nothing. A simple transaction. Tax-deductible charity. But when Margaret brought his coffee and noticed Grace crying at her desk, she frowned. "Should I check on her?" "No," Alexander said quietly. "Leave her be." Margaret left. Alexander stared at his computer screen without seeing it. He'd built his life on control, on keeping people at a distance, on feeling nothing. But something had shifted, and he didn't know if he could stop it. Grace was at her desk when the shouting started. "Where is she? Grace! I know you're here." Her blood turned to ice. That voice. She knew that voice. Derek! Her ex-boyfriend pushed past the reception desk, his face red with anger. Grace stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. "Derek, you need to leave. Don't tell me what to do." He was louder now. Heads turned throughout the office. "You think you can just ignore my calls? Block my number? We broke up 6 months ago. You need to." He grabbed her wrist. "Hard." Grace gasped. The office went silent. "Security's on the way," Margaret said sharply from across the room, phone already in hand. But security didn't arrive first. Alexander did. He emerged from his office without a word. No raised voice. No visible anger. He simply walked toward them, and the air itself seemed to change. Derek looked up. His grip on Grace's wrist loosened. Alexander stopped 3 feet away. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His eyes, cold, unreadable, absolutely terrifying, locked onto Derek. "Let her go." Derek released Grace immediately. "This is a private matter," Derek stammered. "Between me and my girlfriend." "Ex-girlfriend," Grace said quietly, rubbing her wrist. Alexander took 1 step closer. Derek took 2 steps back. "You have 10 seconds to leave this building," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I ever see you near her again, you'll regret it." Something in his tone made Derek believe him. He looked at Grace one last time, shame and fury mixing on his face, then turned and left. The office remained silent. Alexander glanced at Grace. "Are you hurt?" "No. I'm fine. Thank you." He nodded once, then returned to his office without another word. Grace sat down, her hands still trembling. Margaret brought her water. Colleagues whispered. What Grace didn't see, Alexander in his office, making a single phone call. 30 minutes later, Derek's employer received an anonymous tip about financial misconduct. By evening, Derek was fired. By the end of the week, every company in the city had quietly blacklisted his name. Derek left the city and never came back. Grace thanked security that afternoon, unaware they'd never even been called. In the days that followed, people began to notice things. Alexander's brutal 5 a.m. emails, the ones that made executives dread opening their inboxes, stopped completely the week Grace called in sick. When she returned, pale and exhausted, Alexander personally ordered lunch to be delivered to her desk. "Eat," he'd said simply, then walked away. His tone, normally sharp enough to cut glass, softened when he addressed her. Just slightly. Just enough that Margaret raised an eyebrow. He never smiled. But when Grace thanked him for something small, a door held open, a meeting rescheduled to give her time, he'd pause. Just for a second, as if her gratitude meant something. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, everything shifted again. The elevator doors opened, and a woman stepped out. Tall, elegant, beautiful in the way that seemed designed rather than natural. Her heels clicked across the marble floor with absolute confidence. Victoria Ashford. Margaret's face tightened. "Miss Ashford. Mr. Stone isn't expecting. He'll see me." Victoria walked past her, directly into Alexander's office without knocking. Grace looked up from her desk, confused. Through the glass wall, she watched Victoria lean against Alexander's desk. Watched her say something that made him close his laptop. Watched her laugh at something he didn't. Then Victoria's eyes drifted toward the glass. Toward Grace. Her smile faded. She said something to Alexander. He glanced through the window, just once, at Grace. Victoria's expression changed. Cold understanding settled across her features. When she left 10 minutes later, she stopped at Grace's desk. "You're the new assistant," Victoria said. "Not a question." "Yes, ma'am. Grace Montgomery." Victoria studied her for a long moment. How sweet. She left without another word. Grace returned to her work, uneasy but unsure why. In the elevator, Victoria pulled out her phone and texted her mother. "We have a problem." And in his office, Alexander stared at the door Grace sat beyond, wondering when everything had become so complicated. Grace arrived at work to find the office buzzing with energy she didn't understand. Colleagues gathered around computers. Phones pinged with notifications. Someone had brought champagne, actual champagne, to the break room at 9 a.m. "Did you hear?" an intern whispered excitedly. "Mr. Stone's engaged." Grace's world tilted. She set down her bag carefully, as if moving too quickly might shatter something. "What?" "It's all over the news. Alexander Stone and Victoria Ashford. They announced it an hour ago." Grace's hands went cold. She pulled out her phone. The headlines were everywhere. Stone Capital CEO to wed Ashford heiress. Business merger of the decade. Power couple makes it official. There were photos. Alexander in a tailored suit, Victoria beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. They looked perfect together. Untouchable. Grace's chest tightened. She'd known about Victoria. Known she existed. But this made it real. Permanent. "Grace!" Margaret appeared at her desk. "Mr. Stone wants to see you." Grace forced her legs to move. Alexander stood by his window, his back to her. "Close the door." She did. "I assume you've seen the news," he said without turning. "Yes, sir." "Congratulations." The word tasted like ash. He turned then, and for just a moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes. Conflict. Regret. But it vanished so quickly she must have imagined it. "The engagement will require schedule adjustments. More public appearances. Victoria will be visiting the office more frequently." "Of course. I'll coordinate with Margaret." That's all. Grace left before her composure could crack. She made it through the day on autopilot. Answered emails. Organized files. Smiled when people congratulated her on working for such an important man. But when she finally returned to her tiny apartment that night, she collapsed. The tears came hard and fast. Painful. The kind that left her gasping. She'd been so careful. So professional. She'd told herself it was just gratitude. For the job, for the mysterious donation that saved her brother. She'd convinced herself the warmth in her chest when he said her name was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Somewhere between the coffee spill and the quiet moments when his walls came down, she'd fallen in love with Alexander Stone. And he was marrying someone else. Grace opened her laptop with shaking hands. She'd stayed in impossible situations before: poverty, bad jobs, her abusive ex. She'd survived by knowing when to leave. This was one of those times. She typed slowly. "Dear Mr. Stone, I am writing to inform you of my resignation, effective 2 weeks from today. Thank you for the opportunity to work at Stone Capital. I wish you and Miss Ashford every happiness. Sincerely, Grace Montgomery." She printed it, signed it, sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow morning, she'd leave it on his desk before he arrived. Then she'd begin the hardest 2 weeks of her life. Grace didn't sleep that night. Across the city, Alexander stood in his penthouse, staring at a photograph on his phone. He'd taken it accidentally weeks ago. Grace at her desk, sunlight streaming through the window, smiling at something on her screen. He should delete it. He didn't. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Mother wants to meet for brunch tomorrow. Engagement party planning. He didn't respond. The next morning, Alexander arrived at his office at 6 a.m., as always. His coffee was waiting. His schedule organized. Everything perfectly in place. Except for the envelope on his desk. He opened it mechanically, expecting a contract or report. Instead, he found 4 sentences that stopped his heart. His hand trembled, actually trembled, as he read it again. Then again. Resignation. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Alexander Stone felt something he'd never allowed himself to feel before. Fear. Pure, overwhelming fear that he'd just lost something he didn't know he couldn't live without. Alexander stared at Grace's resignation letter until the words blurred. Then he checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. His engagement party started in 13 minutes. 700 guests. His parents. The board of directors. Every major publication in the city. Victoria's family. Contracts worth billions resting on this union. Everything he'd built. Everything he was supposed to be. He stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and walked out. The venue was 15 minutes away. He made it in 8. The ballroom blazed with crystal chandeliers and champagne towers. Photographers positioned themselves at every angle. His mother spotted him immediately, her expression tight with expectation. Alexander, finally. Victoria's been asking, "Where are you going?" He didn't answer. He turned and walked back out. His driver knew without being told. "Stone Capitol Building, sir?" "Yes." "Fast." The office tower was dark except for security lights. Alexander took the elevator to the executive floor, his heart pounding in a way it never had during billion-dollar negotiations. Grace was at her desk. She was packing. A small cardboard box held her few personal items: a photo of her brother, a coffee mug, a plant someone had given her. Her shoulders shook with silent tears. She didn't hear him approach. "Grace!" She spun around, eyes wide and red. "Mr. Stone, I'm sorry, I thought you should be at your party." He crossed the space between them in 3 strides. And took her hand. "What are you? Come with me." "I don't understand." "Grace." His voice was rough. Desperate. "Please." She looked at their joined hands. At his face, the face that never showed emotion, now raw with something she couldn't name. "Okay," she whispered. They didn't speak in the car. Alexander held her hand the entire way, his thumb moving across her knuckles in small, unconscious circles. When they arrived at the venue, Grace finally pulled back. "Alexander, I can't. This is your engagement party." "I know." "Victoria's inside. Your family. Everyone." "I know." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace saw it. The decision already made. The bridge already burning. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I." He led her inside. The ballroom went silent as they entered. 700 faces turned. Cameras flashed. Victoria stood near the stage, her smile freezing when she saw Grace's hand in Alexander's. His mother moved forward. "Alexander, what is the meaning?" He walked past her, past the board members, past Victoria, straight to the microphone at the center of the stage. The room held its breath. Grace stood at the edge of the crowd, trembling, wanting to run but unable to move. Alexander's voice echoed through the sound system. Clear. Steady. Final. "Thank you all for coming tonight." He paused. "I'm ending this engagement." The room exploded. Gasps. Shouts. Camera flashes like lightning. His mother's face went white. "Alexander." "Not for business," he continued, his eyes finding Grace in the crowd. "Not for reputation. Not because of any contract or merger." He took a breath. "Because I'm in love with someone I don't deserve." Victoria's champagne glass shattered on the marble floor. His father stood, face red with fury. The board members erupted in frantic whispers. And Grace couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't believe what was happening. Alexander stepped down from the stage and walked toward her. The crowd parted like a sea. He stopped in front of her, in front of everyone, and said the words that would destroy everything he'd built. "Grace Montgomery, I don't know if you'll forgive me. I don't know if this is already too late. But I'm choosing you. If you'll have me." The cameras captured everything. The chaos. The scandal. The moment Grace's tears started falling again. But this time, for a completely different reason. The headlines were brutal. Stone Capitol in crisis. CEO's scandal costs billions. Ashford family cuts all ties with Stone Enterprises. The fall of Alexander Stone, from glacier to ruin. Within 48 hours, 3 major investors pulled out. His parents released a statement disowning him publicly. Victoria's interview, cold, composed, devastating, painted him as unstable, emotional, unfit to lead. The board called an emergency meeting. Alexander didn't attend. He was standing outside Grace's apartment at 7 a.m., holding 2 cups of coffee. She opened the door in pajamas, eyes still swollen from crying. "Alexander, you shouldn't be here. You should be. May I come in?" She stepped aside. Her apartment was tiny. 1 room. A pull-out couch. Nothing like his penthouse. But it was warm. Lived in. Real. I brought coffee, he said quietly. I don't know what you take in it. Grace almost smiled. Cream. No sugar. He handed her the cup. They sat in silence. Your company, Grace whispered finally. Everything you built is still there. Just smaller. Harder. Your family made their choice. I made mine. Alexander. Her voice cracked. You gave up everything. He looked at her then, really looked at her. No. I finally found something worth keeping. That became their routine. Every morning, Alexander appeared at her door with coffee. He never asked for anything. Never pressured her. Just showed up. Present. Steady. Some mornings, Grace could barely look at him, crushed by guilt over what he'd lost. Other mornings they talked, really talked, about things that mattered. Her brother's recovery. His childhood. The weight of expectations neither of them had chosen. Slowly, impossibly, Alexander began to rebuild. But he didn't do it alone. Grace sat beside him in meetings with the investors who'd stayed. She asked questions he'd never thought to ask. Questions about people, about impact, about building something sustainable rather than just profitable. What if we shifted 10% of our portfolio toward medical research? She suggested one afternoon. Alexander considered it. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed it as sentimental. Now he saw the strategy in it. It's risky, but it's right. He smiled just slightly. Then let's do it. The company stabilized. Not the empire it was, but something better. Something built on principle rather than fear. 6 months after the engagement party, Alexander walked into a board meeting with Grace beside him. His partner now, in every sense of the word. The meeting went smoothly until one executive, emboldened by Alexander's newfound patience, made a joke. Well, at least Stone's finally learned to smile. Guess love really does make you soft. The room went silent. The old Alexander would have ended that man's career with a single sentence. Instead, Alexander leaned back in his chair. And smiled. Truly smiled, the kind that reached his eyes, warm and genuine and completely unexpected. Grace taught me something, he said quietly. Mercy is stronger than fear. Compassion builds more than cruelty ever could. He looked at the executive. Your numbers have been slipping. Instead of firing you, I'm assigning you a mentor. Figure it out. The man blinked, stunned. The entire room stared. Grace squeezed Alexander's hand under the table. After the meeting, Margaret caught Alexander in the hallway. Sir, that was different. Good different. Margaret smiled, something she rarely did. The best different. That evening, Alexander and Grace walked through the city together. No security. No cameras. Just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage. Do you regret it? Grace asked softly. Everything you lost? Alexander stopped walking. He turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Grace, I lost an empire built on ice. But I gained something I didn't know existed. He paused. I gained a life worth living. She kissed him then, right there on the crowded sidewalk. And for the first time in 34 years, Alexander Stone felt completely, genuinely happy. But happiness, they would soon learn, doesn't mean the story is over. The ballroom glittered with hope instead of obligation. Grace stood beside Alexander at the annual Stone Foundation Gala. Not the cold corporate affairs he used to attend, but something entirely different. Children's medical care. Research funding. Families who couldn't afford treatment getting a second chance. The cause she'd inspired. The legacy they'd built together. Miss Montgomery. A woman approached, tears in her eyes. My daughter, she received a grant from your foundation. She's in remission now. I don't know how to thank you. Grace took the woman's hands. You just did. Alexander watched from a few feet away. A year ago, he would have seen this moment as inefficient. Sentimental. A waste of resources. Now he saw it as the point of everything. His employees mingled in the crowd, not stiff and silent like before, but relaxed. Laughing. One of them waved at Alexander, and he nodded back with something that almost resembled warmth. They're different with you now, Grace said softly, rejoining him. I'm different now. It was true. The man who'd fired 3 executives before breakfast was gone. In his place stood someone his team actually wanted to work for, not out of fear, but genuine respect. Margaret approached with champagne. "Sir, the foundation director wants a photo with you both." "Of course." As they posed, Grace leaned close. "You gave up everything for me," she whispered. Alexander's arm tightened around her waist. When the photo was done, he turned to face her fully. "No, Grace. You gave me everything I never had." His voice was low, meant only for her. "A reason to feel. A reason to be more than just cold calculation and control." He paused. "You gave me a life." Grace's eyes filled with tears, the good kind. The music shifted. A slow song. Alexander extended his hand. "Dance with me?" They moved to the center of the floor. Other couples joined, but Grace only saw him. The man who'd terrified an entire industry now held her like she was something precious. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too." He said it easily now, the words that once would have been impossible. They swayed together, and for the first time in 35 years, Alexander Stone felt something beyond control or power or achievement. He felt fully, completely alive. Around them, people watched, not with judgment or scandal, but with the kind of warmth reserved for those who'd found something real. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, smiling. An investor who'd stayed through everything nodded approvingly. Even the catering staff paused to watch the couple at the center of the room. Later that night, back in Alexander's office, Grace noticed something new on his desk. A framed photograph. The two of them at the gala, mid-laugh, Grace's hand on his chest, Alexander looking at her like she was his entire world. Beneath it, a small plaque with an inscription. She walked into his office. He walked out of the dark. Grace traced the words with her finger. "When did you?" "Yesterday," Alexander said from the doorway. "I wanted to remember." "Remember what?" He crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "The day my life actually started." They stood there in the quiet office, the city lights glowing beyond the windows. The empire that had once been built on ice was now something warmer. Smaller, perhaps, but infinitely more valuable. Grace turned in his arms. "What would you sacrifice for love?" Alexander smiled, the real smile that still surprised people who'd known him before. "I already did. And I'd do it again. Every single time." They kissed, surrounded by the life they'd built together. Not perfect. Not without scars. But real. True. Worth everything. And somewhere in the dark city below, another person was working late, exhausted and alone, wondering if there was more to life than survival. The answer, though they didn't know it yet, was yes. There always is. What would you sacrifice for real love? Share your story in the comments below.